Maid's daughter, paid bus fare for an old man. Until a billionaire did something unthinkable. On a bitterly cold winter afternoon in Detroit, a young girl helped an old man board a bus with nothing more than a few worn coins in her pocket. She had no way of knowing that this small, quiet act would one day alter the course of her entire family's life. It began with a sharp, unforgiving voice that sliced through the wind like a verdict. No fare, no ride. The bus driver's words hung heavy in the icy air. Standing at the door was a frail, elderly man, shoulders trembling under a threadbare coat, his hair white and scattered, his eyes vacant, like someone who had just been dropped into a world he no longer recognized. He carried no wallet, no phone, couldn't even recall his name. Behind him stood 11-year-old Abby Thompson, silent and small, in her thin, faded denim jacket. Draped across her shoulder was a cloth bag carrying her mother's work uniform. In her pocket was the last $5 her family had, handed to her that morning with careful instructions to buy milk and a bit of bread for supper. But as she stood there, witnessing the harshness of it all, the driver's scowl, the old man's confusion, his eyes wide and lost like a child separated from his mother, Abby felt something stir deep within. She could not turn away. With fingers numbed by the cold, Abby stepped forward and slipped every last coin and crumpled bill into the fare box. She didn't know the man's name was Walter Beckett, nor that he was a billionaire who had vanished days earlier, lost in the fog of a temporary memory lapse. She only knew one simple truth, one unwavering certainty. No one deserves to be left alone in the dead of winter just because they lack $3. In that moment, a tarnished coin could outweigh a bar of gold, for it was all she had, and it was everything. The bus sighed and creaked, then opened its doors. The driver gave a reluctant nod, as if conceding defeat to the quiet bravery of a child. The old man turned to Abby, hesitating, his eyes glassy not from the cold, but from something deeper, something hard to name. Abby held out her hand to him, a small but steady gesture, the kind her mother had taught her since she was little. That you help people not because they deserve it, but because you can. And because her grandfather, once an Air Force pilot, used to say that a good person is someone who never walks away when they see another in need. In a forgotten corner of Detroit, where rusted signs hang low and the streets wear a heavy coat of oil-stained snow, a quiet act of kindness had just taken place. No one noticed. There were no cameras, no applause, no names written down. No one could have guessed that this was the first link in a chain of events that would one day shake the foundations of Abby's world. And no one could have imagined that the old man whose bus fare she paid would turn out to be the holder of a vast economic empire, preparing to do something that no one could foresee. But in that moment, in the raw, biting cold of Detroit, all that truly existed was the warmth of compassion, a small flame of goodness strong enough to heat an entire frozen afternoon. Dear friend, if your heart has stirred even slightly at the quiet, deeply human act of kindness from Abby, know that this is only the beginning. What lies ahead is a journey filled with wonder and emotion, unfolding between a young girl and an old man lost in memory, both brought together by the unforgiving winter streets of Detroit. And if you'd like to continue walking alongside them to uncover what fate has in store next, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel Emotional Echoes right now. Tap the like button, share this video, and help spread the message of compassion so that stories like this can reach and warm even more hearts across the world. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment below and tell us your location so we can see just how far our story has traveled. Every share, every comment from you is a powerful encouragement that fuels our desire to keep telling these deeply moving stories day after day. And now, let us return to the next chapter in this extraordinary tale. The old man stepped onto the bus slowly, each step a quiet battle, as if his legs had once known only the warm weight of wooden floors and now found themselves lost upon the cold steel bones of the city. Abby guided him gently inside, searching for a seat near the middle of the bus, far enough from the driver to avoid his sharp gaze, yet close enough to keep watch. Walter Beckett lowered himself into the seat, drawing his thin frame into the faded gray wool of his coat, his bony hands gripping the railing tightly. For the first few minutes, he said nothing, only stared through the fogged window, as though trying to fix himself in place among the ghost-like shapes of passing buildings. Abby sat beside him in silence, quietly watching. She wasn't used to helping strangers, but she had never seen anyone look quite so alone. After a long pause, he turned to her. His voice was hoarse but clear, worn like an old record. "Thank you," he said. I think I'm lost." Abby nodded. "I thought so. Did you forget your wallet?" "No," Walter replied, his voice softening, almost fearful of what he might say next. "I'm not sure if I brought one. I just wanted to take a walk." Then I kept walking. The wind woke me up, but I couldn't remember the way back. He raised a trembling hand to his temple, furrowed his brow, then let it fall. There was a quiet confusion in every small motion he made. Abby hesitated. "Do you remember where your home is?" A stretch of silence followed. Walter looked back toward the window, maybe west or south, somewhere near a lake. I remember the sound of water, the light dancing across it like shattered glass. But the name is gone. He let out a soft laugh, tinged with sadness, unable to hide the wound behind his words. Sometimes I'm not even sure I know who I am anymore. I remember the wind, the smell of old jet fuel, the sound of metal striking metal. But I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday." Abby fell quiet. She didn't know what to say. Part of her felt afraid, as if she were staring at a reflection of her own distant future, a place where memories fall like autumn leaves. But another part felt something deeper, more tender. This man wasn't like the homeless souls who wandered near the train station. His coat, though old, had once been tailored. His shoes were good leather, worn but intact. His nails were clean, neatly trimmed. His silver hair was brushed back with care. There was something about him that spoke of order, of dignity, of a life that had once belonged to a world with rules and respect. Abby gripped the bag her mother had given her that morning. Inside was the housekeeper's uniform, still faintly scented with lemon and bleach despite being tightly wrapped. She turned to him. "I'm Abby," she said softly. "And you?" Walter blinked as though answering from a great distance. "I think I'm Walter." Walter Beckett. The name made Abby's eyes widen. Beckett. It rang oddly familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. She didn't ask. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. The bus swayed through streets lined with trembling lights, each turn pressing the old man deeper into his seat, his body curling in against the cold. Abby saw him shiver again. Without thinking, she unwound the thin scarf from around her neck and gently wrapped it around his. She was freezing too, but he needed it more. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes filling with tears. "You're very kind," he whispered. "No one's called me by my name in many days." Abby didn't answer. She turned to the window, watching the streetlights drift backward into the night. Inside her something stirred, something she couldn't quite name, a quiet sense that she had just stepped through a door into something vast, something significant, something far beyond what she could yet understand. But one thing she knew for certain. This old man was not ordinary, and his story was not just about getting lost. The bus rolled on through the bleak winter streets, beneath a sky thick with clouds the color of ash, while the wind bit at the skin like tiny needles. Abby sat still beside Walter, her eyes quietly following the awkward, uncertain movements of the old man. He glanced around the bus, his gaze occasionally lingering on corners or windows, as if searching for something familiar in a sea of unfamiliar shapes, only to turn away each time, resigned. The other passengers stole brief looks at him and then turned back to their own worlds. In a city like this, everyone had a story, but not every story was one worth noticing. The wheels screeched as the bus slowed at the next stop. A middle-aged woman climbed aboard, pulling 2 bulging bags behind her, followed by a man in a construction uniform dusted with mortar and fatigue. One by one, they tapped cards or dropped coins into the fare box. When Walter's turn came, he rose with a tremble, inching slowly to the front. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers fumbling as if hoping something had magically appeared. After a long pause, he shook his head and turned to the driver, his voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. I'm sorry. I boarded at the last stop, but I don't have my wallet. I might have left it somewhere. I just need to get downtown, then I can call my son." The driver, a large man with a tired face and bloodshot eyes from too many early mornings, looked him over with a mixture of irritation and indifference. No fare, no ride. Rules are rules. "Get off the bus, old man." Walter froze, lips pressed tight. "But I'm already on. I'm not trying to cheat anyone. I just lost my wallet. I just need a ride." The driver tapped the wheel impatiently, eyes flicking to his watch. "I don't have time for this. Off the bus. I'm already late." The bus fell silent. No one spoke. No one intervened. Abby felt heat rush to her face, a pulse of indignation rising up through her chest. She stood. "Wait." Her voice was soft but clear. I'll pay for him." The driver looked at her, startled. "What did you say?" She pulled 3 crumpled dollar bills and a few coins from her pocket, her hands shaking from the cold and the courage it took to speak. "This is the money my mom gave me to buy milk, but no one should be left behind just because they lost their wallet." She stepped forward, placing the money into the fare box. Each coin clattered against the metal tray with a sound that echoed louder than any speech, a quiet accusation aimed at the apathy surrounding her. The driver looked at her for a long second, then shrugged. "Money's money. Take your seat. Just don't make trouble." Abby turned and reached for Walter, who still stood frozen in the aisle. She took his hand and gently led him back to their seats. He stared at her as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. His voice, barely audible, brushed the air like the whisper of wind. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Abby looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Because I can't just stand there while someone is treated like trash. Because you remind me of my grandpa. Because if it were my mom in your place, I'd want someone to speak up." Walter turned his face away and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. In that moment, Abby had no idea that something within him had shifted. No longer just a man without a wallet or memory, something deeper was stirring back to life. Perhaps it wasn't the coins that mattered, but the warmth behind them. A small, sincere kindness that asked for nothing in return. And though he didn't yet know what would come next, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This girl had saved him, not just from the cold or the shame, but from something far darker, the slow, quiet fall into complete forgetting. As the bus curved through the last intersection before the narrow lanes of East Detroit, Abby clutched the strap of her mother's bag and glanced at Walter. He sat quietly, hands resting on his knees, head slightly bowed, his eyes somewhere far away. She wanted to ask if he needed help, if someone was waiting for him at home, but something stopped her. She feared any wrong word might pull him further into confusion. When the bus came to a halt, Abby stood and gently told him this was her stop. Walter nodded slowly, his eyes holding on to her for a moment longer, but he said nothing. She smiled, then stepped off the bus. The moment the door opened, the wind cut across her face, sharp and unkind. She pulled her collar tight around her neck and walked quickly toward the row of run-down motel units waiting in the shadows at the end of the street. The building where Abby and her mother lived was a tired slab of concrete, 3 stories tall, its paint peeling in long, curling strips, and its windows patched here and there with duct tape to keep the cold at bay. The elevator had stopped working the winter before, and the hallway lights flickered on and off like old memories, while the muffled sounds of arguments from downstairs rose every now and then like smoke from a forgotten fire. Abby climbed the wooden stairs carefully, avoiding the worn, damp patches where the boards had softened with time. Apartment 3B sat at the end of the corridor. She pulled out her key, gave it a hard twist, and leaned her full weight against the door before it gave way with a reluctant creak. The room met her with a sharp breath of damp air slipping through the cracked window pane where the wind had found its way inside. In the kitchen, the small gas stove was still warm to the touch, a quiet sign that her mother had left not long ago. Abby set down her bag, hung her coat on a bent hook by the door, and pulled out an old towel to stuff into the window frame, trying to block the draft. She turned on the oven and cracked the door open, letting the slow heat spread through the room. That was how they stayed warm on nights like this, now that the central heating had been broken since last year's freeze, and the landlord had found every excuse not to fix it. She opened the fridge. A dim yellow bulb blinked on, revealing the same familiar inventory: a carton with 3 eggs, half a bottle of milk, and a bundle of wilted greens. The last can of soup had been used the week before. Her eyes drifted to the note taped to the fridge, its ink smudged in one corner, the handwriting slightly crooked. "Don't forget to boil water. I'll be home by 6. Eat something light if you're hungry. I love you." It looked like her mother had written it in haste, probably while her aching back flared up again. Abby reached for a small pot, poured in a bit of water, and added the last 3 spoonfuls of oatmeal from a glass jar tucked in the corner. While the water warmed, she sliced in half the piece of dry bread her mother had left out and toasted it lightly over the open oven door until it turned crisp and golden. Dinner tonight would be thin oatmeal and dry bread, no milk, no sugar. She thought of the $5 she had spent helping Mr. Walter, and a flicker of regret passed through her. But then she reminded herself, if she had the chance to do it again, she would. Her mother always said kindness never bankrupts a soul. It just takes longer to turn a profit. When the food was ready, Abby laid it out on the small table by the window. The table was crooked and worn, but it had been dressed with a patchwork cloth she and her mother had sewn together from old fabric scraps. On the wall above hung a few of her pencil drawings, some pressed inside plastic frames, their edges curling ever so slightly. She ate slowly, listening to the soft ticking of the oven, the wind whining through the walls, the footsteps of neighbors passing in the hallway. Outside, the city moved on with its restless noise. But here, inside this cold, narrow room, Abby knew each sound, each silence, as if they were old friends. And in that solitude, she found herself quietly wishing that the old man she had helped had made it home, that he wasn't still wandering the streets, lost like the memories slipping through his mind. She washed her dishes with a little boiled water, rinsing them gently before placing them on a cloth to dry. The wall clock showed just before 6. Abby returned to her small desk, turned on the lamp and pulled out her school books. Her eyes caught sight of the little tin box hidden beneath the shelf. Inside now were only a single quarter and a few scattered pennies. She picked up the quarter, turning it over in her hand, watching how the light from her lamp danced across its worn edges. She remembered the look in Mr. Walter's eyes as she dropped the coins into the fare box. She knew she hadn't bought milk that day. But maybe, just maybe, she had purchased something else far more valuable. A chance, a spark of faith, a thin, invisible thread strong enough to hold someone back from the edge of forgetting. And in that quiet certainty, in that small, humble meal shared with no one but the whispering wind, Abby felt something rare and precious warmth. A warmth not from the oven, but from knowing that even in a world so often indifferent, a small act of compassion could still matter. While Abby bent quietly over her schoolwork in the cold apartment back in the city, nearly 20 miles away, her mother, Sarah Thompson, was on her knees, scrubbing the edge of a Persian rug in a living room large enough to host a basketball game. It was the Langford estate in Bloomfield Hills, and her back screamed with every motion, sharp jolts shooting down her spine, but she didn't stop. Stopping was not an option. It was an unspoken rule Sarah had learned after nearly a decade in this line of work. Housekeepers were not allowed to show fatigue, not in homes where the owners never seemed to believe that pain belonged to anyone but themselves. The rug wasn't dirty, not really, but Mrs. Langford had said that the dust in the fibers dulled the color under the chandelier's light. Sarah didn't argue. She bowed her head and fetched a soft bristled brush and a damp cloth, doing exactly what was asked. The house was silent in that sterile, indifferent way that wealth often carried. The walls were lined with expensive oil paintings, and the spotless glass windows reflected every footstep that passed. Sarah could see her own faint shadow in the glass, a bent figure, quiet and invisible, as if she too were just another piece of furniture. Her morning had started at 5 o'clock, waking before sunrise in the cold, fumbling to light the stove to heat a pot of water to wash her face, and preparing Abby's breakfast with the last of the oats. She had left her usual note on the fridge, then hurried into her coat carrying a small bag that held her black and white uniform. She caught the 6:15 bus, arriving at the Langfords just before 7:30, and began a day made up of endless, nameless tasks that no one noticed unless they were left undone. Cleaning windows, vacuuming corners, laundering curtains, replacing fresh flowers, checking the guest towels, scrubbing sinks, polishing doorknobs, and when she finished one circuit, she began again from the top. Lunch for Sarah was a half sandwich eaten in the dim storage room, where the flickering fluorescent light felt colder than the November wind outside. Some days she barely chewed, afraid she'd be summoned before the last bite was gone. Today, Mrs. Langford had requested the picture frames on the staircase be dusted. There were more than 40 of them, wedding portraits, family vacations, gala evenings captured in the warm light of places Sarah would never go. She wiped each one carefully, watching the joy and silk and champagne smiles stare back at her while she counted the minutes until she could return home. By 3 in the afternoon, while tidying the second-floor bedroom, a sharp pain shot from her lower back down through her hip. She braced herself against the bedpost, drawing in a breath, then straightened up and began to smooth the bedsheet, pulling it taut until not a single wrinkle remained. She had once lost a full day's wages for a coverlet folded 2 inches off-center. Moments like that, Sarah thought of Abby, of her daughter's bright smile in the morning, even when breakfast was just dry bread and watered-down milk. She thought of the rent notice tacked to the fridge, the electric bill stamped in red ink, and the truth that if she lost this job, there would be nothing left for either of them to hold on to. So she kept going. By 5:30, Sarah had changed back into her worn clothes, tied her hair neatly, and stepped out of the Langford estate just as the garden lights flicked on, casting long golden lines across the manicured hedges. She slipped out the back gate, a quiet habit learned over the years. The best housekeepers were the ones who came and went as if they had never been there at all. She caught the last bus heading east, her legs aching and her thoughts blurred from exhaustion. Through the bus window, she watched the city pass in reverse, streetlights trailing behind like fallen stars scattered across the cold, wet pavement. When she reached her building, it took her several minutes to climb the 3 flights of stairs. Every step sent a dull pain through her lower back, but she pushed through it, hand steady on the chipped railing. As she opened the apartment door, she was greeted by the soft sound of Abby murmuring her school lessons and the faint scent of plain oatmeal lingering in the air. The oven door was cracked open, releasing the last of its meager warmth. On the table, 2 clean bowls rested beside a small, neatly laid cloth, and a single coin sat quietly near the salt jar. Sarah set down her bag, took off her shoes, and gently called Abby's name. The girl ran to her, wrapping her small, cold arms around her waist. Sarah pulled her close, holding her tight in the dim glow of the kitchen. She didn't have to ask about dinner. She didn't have to ask how her daughter had gotten through the evening. She could feel it in the silence of the room, in the quiet order Abby had left behind, in the warmth still hovering in the air despite the cold. But what caught her off guard was Abby's eyes. There was something in them tonight, a calm beyond her years, a depth that hadn't been there the morning before. It was as if she had seen something, faced something, something larger than herself. And Sarah felt it in the marrow of her tired bones, in the fragile stillness of their tiny apartment. Something had shifted. Something, somewhere, was stirring. She didn't yet know what it was, but for the first time in a long while, she let herself hope that whatever was coming wouldn't bring more hardship, that maybe, just maybe, this time, change might come with a touch of grace. The next morning, Detroit remained the same dull gray as the day before, its sky the color of lead and its wind sharp as needles, slicing through coats and scarves like they were nothing at all. Abby wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, slipped into her canvas shoes with the frayed heels, and stepped quietly out of the apartment. Her mother was still lying in bed, curled against the ache in her back, worn thin from a day's labor that had taken too much. Sarah had tried to rise early, to make breakfast as she always did, but Abby had stopped her. She said she could manage, that she would get to school on her own. Sarah gave a slow nod, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude, helplessness, and a quiet pride too deep to say aloud. Abby passed through the dark hallway, down the creaking wooden stairs, and out into the street where the snow had melted into puddles of murky water, swirling with oil and the debris of a city that never truly slept. The number 8 bus stop stood at the intersection of Gratiot Avenue and 12th Street, a strange borderland between two worlds. On one side were the workers' tenements, hunched and cramped, echoing with car horns and the thick haze of fuel fumes. On the other side, a row of once bustling storefronts now stood shuttered and fading, their signs washed out by time. Abby stood between those two landscapes, clutching her shoulder bag that held her books and a small lunch tin. The clock read just past 7. The bus was often late, but today the number 8 arrived right on time. It sighed to a stop, doors folding open with a hiss, and she stepped aboard, slipping her last remaining coin into the fare slot. Most of the seats were already full. Abby moved toward the back, looking for a window spot. But as her eyes swept across the faces inside, she froze. There, sitting alone across the aisle, was Walter Beckett. He was bundled in the same worn wool coat, the collar turned up against the cold. A dark knit cap sat crooked on his head, like it had been placed there in a rush. He looked more alert than the day before, but still carried the weight of someone unmoored. His arms were folded, his eyes fixed on the window, though he didn't seem to be seeing anything at all. Abby hesitated, then slowly walked over. "Mr. Walter," she said softly, "I'm Abby." At first, he didn't move. Then his eyes shifted, searching until they settled on her face. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something softer. "Abby," he repeated her name. She sat down beside him. "Did you get home okay yesterday?" she asked. Walter shook his head, not with shame, just a quiet weariness. "No, I don't have a home to go back to. At least, not one I can remember. I wandered until evening. A police officer brought me to a shelter. Not bad, bread and coffee. But I hate places like that, too many people. Feels like you disappear completely. No one knows your name. I'm not even sure I know it." Abby didn't know what to say. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a cookie her mother had wrapped the night before, and held it out to him. "You should eat something." Walter looked at the cookie, then at her. His eyes were wet. "Thank you," he murmured, accepting the small offering. The bus around them smelled faintly of worn jackets, exhaust fumes, and old leather. Voices hummed low in the background, feet shuffled, windows rattled. Yet somehow, in that moment, there was peace. A quiet, gentle stillness, like a single deep note in the middle of a chaotic song. Walter turned to Abby again, voice lower. "I remember you paid my fare yesterday. I brought change today." He reached into his coat pocket and showed her a few crumpled bills and coins. "But I still don't know where I'm going." Abby looked at him. "I'm not really sure where I'm going either," she said honestly. "But if you're not in a hurry, maybe today, you could come with me. My school isn't far. And if you need to call someone, my mom has a phone. She might be able to help." Walter thought for a long moment, then slowly, for the first time since Abby had met him, smiled. "I think I'd like that. Thank you, Abby." She nodded and turned back toward the window, her breath fogging the glass. Sometimes an old city bus doesn't just carry people from one place to another. Sometimes it carries lives, adrift and searching, trying to find their way back to something lost. And sometimes, the most unexpected things begin on the most ordinary journeys. Walter sat beside Abby on the number 8 bus, his eyes drifting toward the dusty window, yet never quite settling on anything. Outside, a light mix of snow and drizzle fell gently from the colorless sky, layering the sidewalks in a thin, ash-gray film that reflected the weak glow of the street lamps. The bus jolted slightly with every pothole it crossed, and each subtle tremor seemed to shake something loose inside Walter's mind, fragments of memories, half-formed and flickering like film reels left too long in the projector. There was something oddly familiar in the sound of the wheels, in the gentle sway of the worn plastic seat, in the rhythm of the city's early morning breath. Walter couldn't name it, but he could feel it, just beneath the surface of thought, like an old photograph not yet fully faded. He remembered mornings like this one, cold and sharp, but not wrapped in a threadbare coat. He remembered walking through glass corridors in a pressed suit, nodding to others as if he were someone important. There were phones ringing, meetings waiting, spreadsheets and strategy. He recalled the golden light of his office, the feel of a silver fountain pen engraved with his name, the numbers on a screen that spoke a language only he could interpret. Then it was gone, all of it, like a flickering bulb that finally gives up in the dark. Walter opened his eyes and exhaled slowly, one hand resting lightly on the wool cap in his lap. He turned toward Abby, who sat quietly by the window, her face thoughtful and far older than her years. A child who knew when silence mattered, who knew how to reach out at the right moment, who gave even when her pockets were nearly empty. Walter asked nothing more. He simply let his mind wander among the broken constellations of memory. He remembered a man older, with a deep voice and stern eyes, perhaps his father. The man had once told him that a successful man is not the one who never falls, but the one who dares to rise again. Yet Walter couldn't recall if he had ever fallen or risen. Then came the image of a woman, her face blurred like glass fogged with breath, but her laughter rang clear, soft as a lullaby. Maybe she was his wife. He remembered candlelight, a glass of wine catching its glow, the way her eyes held his like they were the center of her world. Then came a child's laughter, light footsteps racing down a hallway of polished wood, the sound of a little voice calling out, "Daddy," like a breeze through summer leaves. But none of it came in full, only scattered fragments, missing edges like puzzle pieces without a frame. Abby turned to him, her voice soft and full of care. "Are you feeling better today, Mr. Walter?" He nodded faintly, his gaze still distant. "Yes. Thank you. I'm just trying to remember. I know I'm not a nobody. There's something inside me that insists I used to be someone. But my mind, it's like an old computer missing its hard drive." Abby nodded, her expression calm. "Maybe the memories will come back," she said. "My mom says some things just need time to heal." Walter looked at her then, his eyes warming. "You're like your mother," he said, "strong and wise." Abby didn't answer. She only smiled. She didn't know if she was strong, but she knew this much since that day on the bus. This man no longer felt like a stranger. There was something about him she trusted, something worth holding on to, as if deep down he belonged somewhere better than a bus stop or a crowded shelter. The bus began to slow as they approached the school. Abby stood, waved goodbye, and told him she'd look for him later if he was still around. Walter nodded, still holding the small cookie she'd given him that morning. When the doors closed behind her, he turned to watch her walk away. And in that moment, like a bolt of lightning in the dark, an image burst through his mind, a hallway of marble tile, a tall wooden door engraved with the name Beckett & Co., and a brass nameplate on the reception desk. Walter Beckett, Chief Executive Officer. His heart caught in his chest. Beckett, his own name, and that company. Was it real? Or was it only a dream? But if it were just a dream, why did it feel so vivid, so real, like something that had never truly left him? Walter remained on the number 8 bus after Abby stepped off, his mind stirred into a restless tide by the image that had struck him moments earlier. The name Beckett & Company echoed through his thoughts like a call from a far and distant place, familiar yet blurred, as if spoken through water. He tried to remember, to grasp a single thread that might lead him back into the dim hallways of his past, but each time he reached for it, it slipped through his mental grasp like dry sand pouring between open fingers. He exhaled slowly and leaned back against the seat, turning the untouched cookie in his hand. Then he slid his fingers across the inside of his coat, brushing over a small inner pocket. Something firm nudged against his touch, stopping him short. He slipped his hand inside, searching carefully, and drew out a thin piece of metal. It was an old identification tag made of stainless steel worn dull by time. He turned it toward the weak light. On its faded surface was engraved a name, Walter J. Beckett, followed by his blood type and service number. But it was the inscription on the back hand-carved years ago that caught his eye. No fear, only duty. His heart hammered. The cold seeping in from outside seemed to fall away, replaced by a heat that rose from somewhere deep within him. He gripped the tag tightly as though he had just reclaimed a missing piece of himself, a military tag. He had served, perhaps in the Air Force or the Army. He could not say which, not yet, but his body remembered what his mind still struggled to reach. The weight of the tag on his chest, the early mornings in training camps, the blare of alarms and the echo of boots striking concrete, all flooded back like wind rushing through a door left ajar. He saw himself standing on a parade ground, helmet in hand, gaze forward, the American flag snapping in the bright blue sky behind him. He had once been a soldier, disciplined, purposeful. He had carried ideals, and more than that, he had held a name, a place, a life that had never been meaningless. He tightened his grip around the tag, afraid that letting go might cause the fragile memories forming inside him to crumble once more. The name Beckett was more than a word etched in metal. It was a signpost, a key capable of unlocking the door back to the man he had been. Perhaps Beckett and Company was no illusion at all. Perhaps it was a legacy he had built before his memories were buried. And if that were true, then he was far more than an old man wandering the winter streets with no past to claim. He might hold something weightier than wealth, a truth, a piece of a much larger story. The bus turned down a narrow street and came to a stop. Walter rose carefully, slid the tag back into his inner pocket, and stepped toward the door. He did not know where he was going next, but for the first time he had a direction. He would follow the name. Beckett. He would search city records, visit a library, ask questions wherever he could. As long as any place still held a trace of that name, he would pursue it. He had to know himself again. And he understood now that whatever this journey would become, it had begun with that small steel tag resting quietly against his chest, an old fragment of metal carrying the weight of an entire, forgotten life. That morning, just as Walter stepped off the bus and slipped the identification tag safely back into the inner pocket of his coat. Miles away in the familiar estate at Bloomfield Hills, Sarah Thompson was facing a morning colder than any Detroit wind, a chill that cut through both skin and spirit. It began the moment Mrs. Langford descended the grand staircase, her expression sharp as frost and a thick file tucked under her arm. Sarah was on her knees in the kitchen, wiping the last streak from the tiled floor, the damp cloth, still in her hand when her employer stopped in front of her with an air of judgment already settled. "Sarah, I received feedback from a guest who attended last week's gathering. She says the towels in the guest bathroom were not folded to standard. I don't tolerate careless work in this house." The words were not the beginning of a conversation, but the final sentence of a verdict delivered without appeal. Sarah rose to her feet, her face draining of color. She tried to explain that there had been last-minute changes that day, that Mrs. Langford's daughter had altered the table arrangements twice, that the dinner hour had been shifted unexpectedly, and that she had done everything she could to keep pace. But Mrs. Langford had no interest in hearing anything further. Sarah understood the rules. People in her position were expected to retreat quietly and with a dignity so thin it barely held together. "I think it is best we end things here. Gather your belongings and leave today." With that, Mrs. Langford turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the gleaming kitchen, the ache in her back suddenly spreading down her legs. She said nothing more. She simply went to the small staff room, removed her apron, folded her uniform, and placed it neatly in her bag. Her hands trembled as she tucked in her old toothbrush. The door closed behind her without a goodbye, without a thank you, without even the faintest softening of expression. She stepped out into the cold drizzle, moving quickly toward the bus stop while the wind slipped through the worn layers of her clothing, making her shoulders quiver. The bus ride back toward the eastern side of the city was slower than usual and more crowded. Sarah sat near the door, clutching her small bag tightly on her knees, her gaze fixed ahead though she saw nothing. Her thoughts tangled and knotted with fear. Losing her job meant no paycheck that week, and that paycheck was meant for rent. 3 days remained before payment was due. If she missed it, there would be a warning. Then the electricity would be cut. A few days more, and there would be a formal notice taped to their door. She had lived through that once before, when Abby was just a baby, and she had sworn never again would her child sleep in the back seat of a car. But now, that vow felt as if it were dissolving with every turn of the bus wheels. She reached the apartment and slipped inside without turning on the lights. Abby sat on the small sofa, her books spread before her, but the moment she saw her mother's face, she knew something was wrong. "Mom, are you all right?" Sarah offered a thin smile, one too tired to mask the truth. "I lost my job," she said, her voice almost weightless. The girl stayed silent for a moment, then walked over and took her mother's hand. "You still have me. We'll find a way." Sarah nodded, but inside her, worry rose like a quiet tide striking the edge of a stone already worn down. In the hallway outside, she heard the landlord's footsteps pass and pause, lingering just long enough to feel like a warning. She knew they were running out of time, and unless something changed soon, the small, fragile shelter they called home would slip away from them as easily as breath in the cold air. The next morning, Sarah woke earlier than usual. Darkness still cloaked the small apartment, and only a faint yellow glow slipping through the dusty window pane marked the quiet arrival of a new day. Abby was still asleep, her face calm in a way that seemed untouched by the weight of the world outside, as if the worries hadn't yet found their way into her dreams. Sarah rose slowly, her legs heavy, not only from the persistent ache that ran from her back down to her knees, but from the pressure mounting steadily within her. She turned on the faucet in the kitchen and waited. A thin stream of lukewarm water finally emerged. The apartment felt as if it were aging alongside them, each drip from a pipe and each peeling patch of wall whispering silent warnings of something nearing, something breaking. When she opened the door to check for mail and retrieve the morning paper, time seemed to pause. On the gray wood of the front door, a white sheet of paper had been taped neatly, the black lettering bold and inescapable. Notice of lease termination. Sarah froze. A gust of cold air swept through the hallway, making the paper tremble slightly as if mocking her. Her eyes scanned the lines slowly, refusing to accept what she already knew. The tenant has failed to meet payment obligations as stated in the lease agreement. You are required to vacate the premises within 5 days of this notice. Failure to do so will result in legal eviction. At the bottom, an illegible signature and a faded red stamp sealed its finality. She peeled the notice from the door, folded it carefully, and walked back inside like a shadow retreating from the cold. Abby was awake now, tying her hair in front of the mirror. When she turned and saw her mother's pale face, her expression changed. Something had shifted. Something had been lost. "What is it, Mom?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She laid the paper down on the table, next to the untouched bowl of oatmeal Abby had yet to eat. The girl read the bold letters, then the lines below them. The room grew still, the silence thick as fog. She swallowed hard and sat down slowly. "Are we going to lose our home?" she asked. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the window, as if searching for a way out through the gray veil of morning. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I've tried. I've really tried. But everything's crashing in at once. We still have a few days. Maybe I can borrow something, or maybe I'll find another job soon." But even as she spoke, she knew the words were no more than threads of fragile hope. There was no close family to call, no old friend waiting with a spare room. Rent in Detroit was climbing month after month, and a single mother without a job was not the kind of tenant landlords were eager to take in. She picked up her old phone and scrolled through the contact list. Not a single name felt possible to call. Not a single one brought the courage to press dial. Then, as if on cue, Abby rose, walked to her school bag, and pulled out a small envelope. "Mom, I have this. It's the prize money from last month for top student. I was saving it. As a surprise. It's only a few dozen dollars, but maybe it'll help." Sarah stared at her daughter, her eyes stinging. She couldn't understand how a 12-year-old could be so kind, so thoughtful, so unshakably good in a world that so often felt cruel and unfair. She pulled the girl into her arms, her hands trembling as she stroked her tangled hair. It wasn't the money in the envelope that broke her. It was something far more powerful, a quiet, steady kind of love, a belief that hadn't yet been crushed, a small but fierce resilience that refused to be dimmed. Out in the hallway, the eviction notice might have marked the end for someone else, but for Sarah and Abby, it was only an ellipsis, not a period. Their story wasn't finished, and whatever it took, they would keep writing it, no matter the cost. That day, Walter wandered the aging streets of downtown Detroit, the old identification tag pressed close to his chest. He stopped before a 3-story red brick building, its windows dulled with dust. This wasn't the gleaming glass skyscraper where his company now operated on the other side of the city. This was the old Beckett building, the place where it all began 40 years ago, now shuttered and waiting for renovation. Walter pushed open the creaking glass door. He had kept the keys in his coat all these years out of sentiment. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and silence. He walked to the center of the dusty room and touched a tarnished nameplate left on a forgotten desk. Walter J. Beckett, founder. The memories flooded back. He remembered starting here with nothing. He remembered the accident that had scrambled his mind days ago, causing him to wander away from his estate, confused and frightened. He remembered who he was. He sat in the worn leather chair, closing his eyes as the fragments of his life reassembled. He was not a lost soul. He was a father, a husband, and a leader. And he remembered the little girl, Abby, who had saved him when he was nothing but a stranger in the cold. Walter opened his eyes. He knew he couldn't stay here. He reached into the lining of his coat, finding the emergency cell phone his security team insisted he carry, a device he had forgotten until this very moment of clarity. He pressed the speed dial. "This is Walter," he said, his voice regaining the steady authority of a CEO. "I'm at the old building on 4th Street. Send the car and prepare the legal team. I have a debt to repay, and I'm going to need everything we have to do it. Right?" That morning, the aging apartment block on Jefferson Avenue sat in its usual silence, unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The snow fell gently, dusting the chipped steps and clinging to the stained edges of the building like a worn-out shawl, while the wind whispered through the cracks in doors and windows like the ceaseless sigh of a winter that refused to end. Inside the 3rd-floor apartment, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice carefully folded and placed before her, as if the act of keeping it neat might somehow contain the chaos it represented. Abby stood near the window, clutching her school bag, her small frame heavy with quiet dread. Then, without warning, the steady hum of an unfamiliar engine rose from the street below. It wasn't the strained sputter of the usual rusted sedans or delivery vans that passed through their neighborhood. This was something different, low, smooth, and unmistakably refined. A sleek black limousine came to a silent stop in front of the building. Its polished surface reflected the gray sky above like still water. The back window eased down, revealing a driver in a sharp suit, gloved hands resting with precision, a pale hat sitting squarely on his head. He stepped out, unrushed, and opened the rear door with practiced grace. From within, a man emerged, older, tall, composed, every movement deliberate. Walter Beckett. He wore a charcoal gray overcoat, the collar turned up against the wind, a thick scarf wrapped neatly at his neck. His silver hair was combed back, and though his face bore the lines of age and time, his eyes held a calm, quiet power. From windows along the building, curious neighbors peeked out, drawn by the strange elegance of the scene below. This didn't belong here. That car, that man, they were like a grand piano in an abandoned warehouse. But Walter didn't seem out of place. He looked up toward the upper floors until his gaze stopped at a single window. The 3rd floor, the place where he had once seen Abby standing, watching the street in the fading light. Abby saw him too and froze. There was no mistaking him. Her eyes widened. "Mom," she whispered, "it's Mr. Walter." Sarah moved to the window, confusion spreading across her face, and then came a knock at the door. A young man in a suit stood in the hallway, polite and composed. "Excuse me," he said. "Is this the residence of Sarah Thompson and her daughter Abby? Is Abby the girl who helped an elderly gentleman on the bus last week?" Before Sarah could answer, Walter appeared behind him. He didn't need confirmation. The moment he saw Abby, he knew he was where he was meant to be. "Hello," he said softly. "Do you remember me?" Abby nodded, still stunned. Sarah stood speechless, unsure whether this was kindness or some elaborate mistake. Walter turned to her, his voice quiet, steady. "I owe you both a debt I can never repay, and I've come to try." He held out a thick envelope. "This," he said, "is a year's rent. But that's only the beginning. I'd like to talk to you about a job. A real opportunity. But first, I need you both to pack your things. This afternoon, the car will come to take you somewhere better." Abby stared in disbelief. Sarah blinked, her voice faltering. Who are you?" Walter offered a gentle smile. "I'm Walter Beckett. Perhaps that name doesn't mean much anymore. But if there's one thing I've never forgotten, it's the value of kindness. Your daughter didn't stop to ask who I was, what I had, or whether I deserved her help. She simply saw someone in need and reached out. Now it's my turn." He turned slightly, as if addressing them both and the room around them. "I won't let that little girl grow up with the fear of being thrown out into the street, and I won't let a mother like you go on begging for work day after day. It's time for things to change." And with that, the cold wind that had long claimed that hallway seemed, for once, to pause. As if even winter itself understood something had shifted. Something was finally beginning again. That morning, the crumbling apartment block on Jefferson Avenue seemed to hold its breath. In the quiet hush of winter, a black limousine had not merely returned an old man to his memories, it had brought with it a promise, a second chance, and a truth made real in the simplest form. A debt repaid, not in words but in action. When Abby opened the door and stepped aside to let Walter in, she did so with the cautious reverence of someone inviting something sacred into a space too small for such significance. Their third-floor apartment had never welcomed a guest of note, let alone a man who had just stepped out of a car that gleamed like it didn't belong anywhere near the rusting bones of this forgotten building. Walter ducked his head slightly as he crossed the threshold. His eyes moved slowly across the room, the peeling walls, the scuffed floorboards, the small table pressed against the window where 2 bowls of cold oatmeal sat beside a folded eviction notice. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, listening to the silence, to the careful breaths of a mother and daughter who had long since learned not to expect miracles. Sarah hovered behind her daughter, trying to make sense of the moment. Just days ago she had lost her job, faced eviction, and now this man, this stranger with kind eyes and quiet certainty, was here saying he could change everything. Walter turned to Abby, offering a gentle smile. "You live here?" he asked. Abby nodded. "Yes, sir. For as long as I can remember, this has been our home." He looked around. In a place so many would turn away from, a child had chosen to give what little she had to someone she didn't know. Walter moved toward the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He placed his hand on the worn wood, fingers brushing a long scratch Abby had always used as a ruler for her math homework. Sarah stepped forward and poured him a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why are you here?" Walter lifted the glass but didn't drink. His eyes met hers with calm resolve. "Because your daughter gave me more than a bus ticket. She gave me a reason to remember who I am." Sarah said nothing. She couldn't. His words filled the room like warm light breaking through a long winter. He continued. "When Abby helped me, I stopped being a man lost in the fog. I saw myself again in her eyes. I once had a son, Mark. Your daughter has his eyes. And in the moment she reached for me, I knew I couldn't go on living like a ghost." He paused, then reached into his coat and placed an old dog tag on the table. This was the first thing that began to lead me back. But Abby brought me to the beginning of that road. The room fell still. No one dared speak, as if afraid the moment might vanish if named aloud. Then Walter continued, his voice quieter, firmer. "I've been in touch with my attorney. My estate, my company, and my accounts are being reinstated. But the first thing I want to do is make sure that neither of you ever have to fear losing your home again. I want to move you to a new place, somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere that truly feels like home." Abby looked up at her mother. Sarah met Walter's eyes. In hers was a mixture of gratitude and the quiet, hardened skepticism of a woman who had been let down too many times to believe in fairy tales. But there was something in Walter's voice steady, unwavering, that didn't ask to be believed. It simply was, not a promise dressed in poetry, just the truth, and she felt it. When Walter stood, Abby suddenly reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapped around his. He looked down, surprised, and gently closed his hand around hers in return. In that silent gesture, something shifted. Everything changed in that moment, not because of money, not because of the car waiting outside, but because kindness, when given at the right time, always finds a way to return. Sometimes it comes back as a second chance. Sometimes it comes back as an entirely new life. And for Walter, Sarah, and Abby, it marked the beginning of something none of them had believed they still deserved: a different future. A life not built from blood, but from choice. A family made not by fate, but by grace. That afternoon, as the black limousine pulled quietly away from the crumbling apartment block on Jefferson Avenue, the neighborhood watched from behind curtain-drawn windows, murmuring in disbelief. No one understood what had just happened, only that a well-dressed older man had stepped from a luxury car, entered a place long forgotten by the city, and left with two familiar figures: a woman who walked with tired shoulders and a child known for trudging through snow in a coat too thin for winter. But for Walter Beckett, everything was clear now. He hadn't just come back to himself, he had come back to make things right. Inside the car, Sarah sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, afraid to believe that what was unfolding wasn't just some elaborate dream. Beside her, Abby pressed her face to the window, her eyes wide and shining, as if every tree, every street lamp flashing past was proof that something magical was finally, quietly, becoming real. Walter sat across from them, his fingers interlaced, resting on his knees. The vacant stare that had once clouded his eyes was gone. In its place lived clarity, resolve, and a quiet flood of emotion that seemed to settle into every line of his weathered face. After several minutes, he turned toward his assistant seated nearby. His voice was low, deliberate. "Schedule a meeting with the legal team for tomorrow. I want the Beckett Family Foundation reactivated, and I want a full review of Sarah Thompson's background and qualifications. I want her to have every option available: education, vocational training, managerial placement, whatever she chooses." The assistant nodded once. There were no follow-up questions. This was not a whim. This was a decision rooted deep, formed not by obligation but by something stronger: conviction. Walter turned to Sarah, his expression softened. "You don't need to thank me," he said, "truly. Your daughter saved me at the moment I was most lost. No one else, not a doctor, not a social worker, not the police. A girl, not yet 13, with nothing in her pocket but a few coins, and a heart that didn't know how to turn away from another person's pain. People spend their entire lives searching for a reason to exist. I found mine again, at a bus stop, in your daughter's eyes, in her hands." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She had never imagined that anyone might see Abby really see her for all that she was. To the world, her daughter was just another child from a poor neighborhood, but to Walter, she was a hero. He continued, his voice thick with feeling. "That little girl gave me back my name, my story. Now it's my turn to restore a piece of the world she lives in, not just with money, with opportunity, with protection, with the truth that kindness should not be a rare thing, but something that spreads, freely, bravely, without condition." As the limousine turned onto a quiet street where snow rested on bare tree limbs like lace, a small house came into view at the end of the block. Warm light glowed from the windows, and a whisper of smoke curled from a chimney above the gray-tiled roof. Walter looked back at the two of them. "This is your new home," he said. "For now, until you choose what's next." Sarah wrapped her arms around Abby, overcome. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But her eyes, shimmering in the fading light, said everything. And there, in the muted hush of a winter twilight, a story that had begun with nothing but a few coins, an empty seat on a city bus, and the quiet mercy of a child's heart, turned 3 lives in a new direction. A direction lit not by luck, nor by charity, but by something rarer, still the kind of compassion that asks for nothing in return and changes everything in its path. 1 week after moving into their new home, Sarah and Abby's lives seemed to come alive with a quiet breath of renewal. Each morning, the soft sunlight would spill gently through the kitchen window, casting a golden hue across the small wooden table where mother and daughter shared their breakfasts and exchanged quiet words before the day began. Abby no longer wore that worn-out coat on her way to school, nor did she trudge silently through the snow with her head bowed. She had been transferred to a small private school where every child was treated with care, where teachers called students by name with genuine respect, and where kindness was not mistaken for weakness. On her first day of class, Abby stepped into the school building with wide, awestruck eyes. The schoolyard was clean, the classrooms were brightly lit, and perhaps most surprising of all were the smiles that greeted her. Not a single look of pity, not a whisper behind her back, just children being exactly what they were meant to be. And now, Abby was one of them. Tucked safely in her backpack was the small tag Walter had given her. A simple token, yet for Abby, it was a reminder that even the most extraordinary things could begin from a single act of kindness. While Abby was taking her first steps into this new chapter of learning, Sarah too found herself on the threshold of something unexpected. One afternoon, just as Abby had returned from school and was animatedly telling her mother about being invited to join the book club, the landline rang. Walter's voice came through, steady and warm, just as it had been the day they first met. "I've just come out of a meeting with the interim board. I'd like you to come to the office tomorrow morning, not as someone receiving help, but as someone I need on my team." Sarah was taken aback. She didn't quite know what to hope for. The next morning, she arrived at the headquarters of Beckett and Company, the very building Walter had once wandered through in the haze of his memories. But now, the building was alight, newly cleaned, freshly painted, with a nameplate restored to the front. Beckett and Company, rebuilding on legacy and trust. Walter greeted her on the third floor, standing beside a wall filled with photographs of charitable campaigns, community projects, and scholarship programs for underprivileged children. "I want you to join the Educational Development Fund coordination team," he said, "not just because you know what hardship looks like, but because you see hope where others might not." Sarah sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly as if she feared this moment might slip away if she held it too loosely. Walter continued, "You'll receive training if needed. But I believe your instincts and your heart are already more than enough. I want to start a scholarship program named after Abby to honor what she did. And I want you to be the one to tell that story to other children." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Not because of the job, not even because of the salary that came with it, but because, for the first time in her life, she was not being seen as a single mother to be rescued, but as someone of real and lasting worth. She reached out and took Walter's hand. She said nothing. Her eyes said it all. That day, Sarah returned home and greeted Abby with a smile that felt whole, a smile that came from somewhere deeper than habit or politeness. The small kitchen was filled with the warm, comforting scent of pastries she had baked herself. That evening, the two of them sat side by side, flipping through old photographs, their fingers pausing now and then on faded faces and places, before drifting into conversations about the future, as though it were something close enough to touch. Their story had begun with the price of a single bus fare, but now it was being continued through action, through gratitude, and through a shared belief that kindness, no matter how small, is never wasted. And for Abby, the new school had become far more than a place to learn letters and numbers. It was where she was beginning to believe in the quiet miracles she herself had helped to shape. Since the day she accepted Walter's invitation, Sarah's life had taken a turn in ways she had never imagined. Mornings were no longer hurried routines, filled with a worn coat and a cold sandwich packed for Abby. Instead, they began with soft sunlight through the curtains, a warm cup of coffee held gently in both hands, and the quiet pride of being seen, finally, as a woman of true capability. Walter had entrusted her not only with coordinating the scholarship fund named after Abby, but also in time, with something far greater. One afternoon, as they reviewed plans for upgrading housing units for those without shelter, Walter rested his hand on a thick folder and spoke with a voice calm but resolute. "I want you to manage the Beckett estate." Sarah was taken aback. She had heard of the estate. It was an old, sprawling home on the northern edge of the city, once a place where the Beckett family gathered, where important guests were hosted, and where Walter himself had lived for many years before tragedy struck. Since the accident that had left him adrift and forgetful, the estate had stood silent, a relic of a life interrupted. But now, with the world around him stirring back to life, Walter didn't want that house to remain a memory. He wanted it to be part of something new. Sarah didn't know what to say. Managing an estate of that size and history had never existed in even the farthest corners of her imagination. But Walter looked at her and waited, his gaze steady, knowing what weighed on her mind. "I don't need someone who already knows everything. I need someone willing to learn. You held together a home with nothing but your own two hands. I believe you can hold this place too and turn it into a sanctuary for those who have lost their way, just like I once did." Sarah nodded slowly, but with certainty. On her first day, she brought Abby with her to the estate. The house stood tall, surrounded by gardens where the red leaves of autumn were falling in thick, swirling blankets. The roof rose high above them, the windows framed with intricate carvings that spoke of another time, and the interior still breathed the warmth of its history, quiet but dignified. The small staff had already been rehired by Walter, and Sarah was introduced as the one in charge of it all. She began cautiously, learning the rhythms of the estate, coordinating with vendors, setting up event schedules, inspecting maintenance systems, and, most importantly, bringing back the spirit of a place that had slept too long in silence. Each night, Sarah made her way through the estate, carefully checking every room before turning off the lights, just as she used to do in the small apartment they once called home. She tended to the house, not as a caretaker, but as someone nurturing something of her own. Abby, too, had grown accustomed to her spacious new room, with a desk by the window and a bookshelf filled with stories. But what brought the most joy to the little girl was not the size of the space, but the sight each morning of her mother emerging from her own office, notebook in hand, her face calm and confident, her eyes glowing with quiet happiness. Sarah was no longer the woman who once pleaded for extra hours at the restaurant, nor the one who silently washed dishes long after closing time. Now, she was the one who coordinated, the one who kept time in a house steeped in history and newly alive with change. Every weekend, the estate opened its doors to small groups from the community, especially single mothers and children who had once lived in shelters. They gathered to hear the story of a single coin given on a cold winter bus ride, and in that story, they began to see pieces of themselves reflected in the quiet transformation of a woman who had once stood at the edge of the city. To Sarah, the job was never just a role. It was a symbol, a thread connecting the hardship of the past to the hope of the present. It was a space where she could simply be herself, strong, composed, and full of compassion. And every time she passed the wooden sign at the front gate, carved with the words, "Beckett Estate, a house of opportunity," she would pause for a moment, smile, and silently give thanks for the second beginning life had granted her, born from the very kindness her daughter had offered in the middle of that long winter. Word of Walter Beckett's return spread quickly through the business world, yet what truly stirred the community was not his reclaiming of the company, but the tangible choices he made in the days that followed. One of his first directives to his legal team and staff was to investigate the old apartment complex on Jefferson Avenue, where Sarah and Abby had once lived. He had never forgotten the cracked stairs, the leaking roof, the broken heating through the bitter cold months, or the resigned eyes of the residents who called that place home. The findings arrived swiftly. The building was owned by a small real estate company run by a man named Lester Holman. For years, Lester had received dozens of complaints from tenants about the dangerously poor conditions, yet he ignored them all. Not only had he refused to make repairs, but he had steadily raised the rent without offering any improvements. When Sarah lost her job and fell behind on rent, it was Lester who issued the eviction notice immediately, without hesitation, despite knowing she was a single mother with a young child and had caused no trouble. Walter did not remain silent. He instructed his legal team to file a formal lawsuit with the city and reached out to organizations dedicated to protecting the rights of low-income tenants. Within a matter of weeks, Lester came under investigation for a wide range of violations, including failure to maintain safe living conditions, breaches of housing codes, and tax evasion on undeclared rental income. The media took notice. Images of peeling walls, flickering wiring, mold-covered ceilings, and substandard bathrooms were circulated widely, sparking outrage across the public. While Lester faced mounting legal consequences, Walter made a move no one had anticipated. Through the Beckett Family Foundation, he quietly purchased the entire apartment complex. But instead of tearing it down, he chose to restore it. The old building was renamed Abbey Row, in honor of the little girl who had once called it home and whose small act of kindness had started it all. Walter hired a team of young architects and gave them a clear directive: preserve the soul of the neighborhood, but rebuild every structure with dignity. The apartments were outfitted with modern heating systems, improved soundproofing, new elevators, fresh coats of paint on every wall and hallway. The small courtyard in the back was transformed into a safe, cheerful play area, with slides, benches, greenery, and lighting that welcomed children even after sunset. A communal room was opened on the ground floor, designed as a space where residents could gather, learn new skills, or attend free classes and workshops. On the day of the grand reopening, Walter stood in the courtyard beside Sarah and Abby, facing a crowd of both former and new residents. He didn't speak about himself. Instead, he told the story of a winter afternoon, when a little girl gave a few coins to an old man who had lost his way, and how, from that quiet act of compassion, everyone standing there that day had found themselves under the roof of a place that was finally worthy of being called home. In that moment, no one thought of the old landlord anymore. Lester Holman had become nothing more than a name buried in paperwork. But Walter Beckett, Sarah, and Abby, they had become something else entirely. A living reminder of a timeless truth, that kindness, no matter how small, can transform a street, a community, and the course of many lives. A year had passed since that cold afternoon at the Jefferson Avenue bus stop, and Detroit had once again settled into the quiet hush of winter. Snow fell gently, covering the sidewalks and rooftops with soft, pillowy layers. But for Sarah and Abby, this winter no longer carried the weight it once did. Inside the warm halls of the Beckett estate, the fireplace burned with a golden glow, casting flickering light across the polished wood-paneled walls. The scent of fresh pastries and cinnamon tea drifted through the kitchen, where Sarah was carefully slicing small pieces of cake onto delicate porcelain plates. Abby sat by the window, a library book open in her hands, occasionally glancing out to watch the neighborhood children laughing and playing in the snow. It was such an ordinary scene, so peaceful, that no one could have guessed just a year ago they had been struggling to hold on to a crumbling apartment, living meal to meal, clinging to the last shelter they could afford. Walter stepped into the room, a thick sweater over his shoulders dusted with a light layer of snow. He had just returned from Abbey Row, where they had completed a winter coat distribution for children in the area. Each visit, he said, felt like returning to a part of his own heart. Sarah took his coat and hung it by the door. Abby ran to him, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug, just as she did after every one of his trips. Walter smiled, resting his hand gently on her head. "You've grown taller again," he said, and Abby giggled. Sarah poured him a cup of tea, and the three of them sat near the fire. In moments like these, the house felt alive with the memory of something deeply human, not bound by blood, but built on love. Walter watched the fire, then spoke softly. "It's been a year," Sarah nodded. She didn't say anything more, but in her eyes, in the tender smile she offered Abby, in the quiet way she looked back at him, every word of gratitude had already been said. He turned to Abby. "Do you still have that tag from that day?" Abby dashed upstairs and returned with a small wooden box. She opened it carefully, revealing the old metal tag, now polished to a clean shine. It was the most precious thing she owned, not for its material worth, but because it reminded her that one small choice could open the door to an entirely new world. Walter held the tag in his hands, turning it gently, then sighed. "That day when you helped me onto the bus, I thought it was just a fleeting moment. I never imagined it would begin all of this." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you turned that moment into something extraordinary for so many others." Walter shook his head. "No," he said. Abby started it. I only chose not to let it slip away. Outside, the snow was still falling. Inside the house, the glow of the fireplace spread its warmth like a gentle embrace, wrapping around all that had once been hurt, once been cold. This winter was no longer just a season of chill. For Walter, Sarah, and Abby, it had become a season of healing, of reunion, and of steady footsteps moving forward. Along the living room wall, Walter had hung a small photograph capturing the moment the three of them stood before Abbey Row on the day it reopened. Beneath the frame, a simple hand-carved inscription read, "One winter, one coin, and one heart that chose to care." Whenever someone asked about the story behind the picture, Walter would smile quietly and say, "It's a memory of a little girl who saved me from the life I was lost in. And it's also why I believe that sometimes all it takes to change the world is to pause, to notice, and to choose not to turn away from what is right, no matter how small it may seem." In that house, winter was no longer simply a time of year. It had become a beginning, a season of rebirth and of quiet miracles more enduring than anything else. That single coin Abby had dropped into the bus fare box that day was never meant to earn her anything. It was simply a gift, an impulse to help a stranger left behind in the dead of winter. A small act, seemingly insignificant amid the rush of daily life, yet it opened the door to a profound change for a man who had forgotten himself and for a family barely holding on. Walter Beckett had once lost his name, his past, and his purpose, but it was the unassuming kindness of a 12-year-old girl that brought him back to himself, helped him recover his memories, and more importantly, helped him rediscover his reason to live and to give. This story is not just about Walter or Sarah or Abby. It is the story of any one of us who has ever stood at the edge of hardship, faced with the choice between indifference and compassion. There are moments in life when the only thing we may have to give is a gesture, a gentle word, a look of empathy, or as in this story, a single coin. But sometimes it is precisely that kind of quiet kindness that sends out ripples farther than we can imagine. A coin exchanged for a life is not a miracle. It is proof that humanity still holds a place in this fast and complicated world. You may not have wealth, power, or status, but you still hold the ability to change someone's world through an act born from the heart. And dear listener, how do you feel after hearing this story? Have you ever found yourself in a moment where a small kindness could have changed everything, but no one reached out? Or were you the one who offered that silent, unseen help to someone in need? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice, your reflection, may touch the hearts of thousands of others who are also listening to this channel. Emotional Echoes. If you love stories that awaken the spirit, stories that speak to our shared humanity and bring honest, quiet emotion to life, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it to help spread the message of compassion to more people around the world. Every subscription is a generous hand extended to us, helping us continue to bring meaningful stories into the everyday. Thank you for being part of Emotional Echoes and walking with us as we uncover beauty in the simplest of things. We hope you are well, that your days are filled with joy, and that peace lives quietly in your heart. Until next time, be well and take care. Be